I want to thank John Hockenberry, Linda Downey, Nick LaRusso, and their colleagues for the privilege of actually being able to share the Transform podium today. And also to you for coming here on what's probably one of the last decent Sunday afternoons left this year. So I'll start with a pretest question. Who are these innovators who've transformed society? And what, if anything, do they have to do with the obesity epidemic? And we won't answer these now. We'll maybe talk about that at the end of the talk. But speaking of invention, let's talk about the invention of sleep, and as expressed in Don Quixote, and I'll read this to you. Blessings on him who first invented sleep. It covers a man all over, thoughts and all, like a cloak. It is meat for the hungry, drink for the thirsty, heat for the cold, and cold for the hot. It makes a shepherd equal to the monarch and the fool to the wise. Now what exactly are we seeing here? That sleep gives you security, it gives you a sense of well-being, that it satiates both your hunger and your thirst, that it even perhaps helps regulate your temperature, and it certainly increases your wealth and your wisdom, at least in your dreams. Now, how much true biological insight is there in this literary treasure? And we'll talk about some of that in the next few slides. The title of my talk is Sleep Apnea and Sleep Deprivation. The less you sleep, the more you eat. And the question mark is very deliberate, because really this is very much a work in progress. We're testing hypotheses, and we're trying to address reasons why the epidemic of obesity has very much exploded over the last 10 years or so, and perhaps what we can do about that. So I'll talk about several things today. I'll talk about obesity, the problem, then tell you about obstructive sleep apnea, then talk about sleep deprivation, and then talk about how sleep impairment, whether because of sleep apnea or sleep deprivation, can lead on to increased weight gain. So when we think of obesity, certainly the popular culture has mirrored the change in our body phenotypes over the last 100 years or so. And I think you'll see that when you look at the old Westerns from way back when, you look how lean and thin the people were, and what they look like now. This is actually validated by scientific investigation. These are data from epidemiologic surveys looking at the percentage of people in the United States who are obese, defined as a BMI of more than 30 kilograms per meter squared. And you see, back in 1990, which sadly to me doesn't seem that long ago, 10 to 14%, the entire United States, never more than 10 to 14% people obese in any given state. Now let's look then 7 years later, 1997. These colors have virtually disappeared. We've now added two new categories, a royal blue and mauve orange, not sure. But these new categories to cover the increase in obese people. And then fast forward from 1997 to 2009. And here we have Colorado, just a lone, steadfast state holding out against the epidemic of obesity sweeping the nation. But sadly, 1 year later, you find that the great state of Colorado has surrendered, and the nation is being swept by a tide of polka dots, where people are more than 30% of people in any given state are obese. And so this is really something that's been progressing, that we've noticed in terms of disease conditions, in terms of trying to fit people into size 2 dresses and pants. The sizes have changed. But the important thing from my perspective today is that as people get more obese, their likelihood of getting sleep apnea increases. And I won't belabor the details of the slide, merely to say that this shows a decrease in weight and this shows an increase in weight. And when your weight goes up, the severity of sleep apnea gets worse. And when your weight goes down, sleep apnea tends to become attenuated. So the more obese people are, the more likely they are to have obstructive sleep apnea. Now, it's actually more than that. It's not just that being obese gives you obstructive sleep apnea. These data from Brad Phillips, when he worked in our lab, looked at the gain in weight in people with newly diagnosed obstructive sleep apnea. And Brad asked the question, how much weight did you put on in the year before we realized that you had sleep apnea? The yellow are people with sleep apnea, males and females. The white are similarly obese people who didn't have sleep apnea. And what was striking was that if you had sleep apnea today, newly diagnosed, the chances are that you put on between 6 to 8 kilograms of weight in the year before the diagnosis. Now, we can explain this in two ways. First, that if you put on weight, you develop sleep apnea. But the second way, and the way that we think is really operative here, is that having sleep apnea for various reasons predisposes you to gaining weight, whether it's through eating more, through exercising less, a combination of both remains to be determined. So what is obstructive sleep apnea? Essentially, what happens in sleep apnea is, and before I do that, I'll talk about the prevalence, by the way. These data from 1993. And as you know, the prevalence of obesity has gone up significantly since then. So this number, this estimate of 15 million people with sleep apnea has been revised upwards. And we're now thinking probably about 25 million people have significant sleep apnea. That's a prevalence probably greater than diabetes, or at least approaching the prevalence of diabetes. Now, the reason people get sleep apnea is complex, but in a simple kind of way, what happens is they desperately try to breathe, but the upper airway becomes flaccid like a wet paper straw, so it collapses on inspiration. And the reason it becomes flaccid is this. Here's normal breathing during sleep. This is a hypopnea where you've got a partial obstruction. This is an apnea where you have a full obstruction. The reason you obstruct during sleep and not during wakefulness is because when you're asleep, particularly when you're dreaming, you lose your postural muscle tone. And there's a good reason for that. In a simple kind of way, the reason is that it stops you from acting out your dreams. So when you lose your postural muscle tone, you also lose the tone in the upper airway, which allows the upper airway to collapse on inspiration and also allows this tongue to fall backwards into the airway, impinging on airflow, causing, again, an occlusion. Which is the reason why when you kick your spouses, your husbands, let's admit it's husbands mainly, you kick your husband, he lies on his side. The reason he stops snoring so badly is because the gravitational pull on this hypotonic tongue is now absent. So that's the reason you get an obstruction when you're sleeping, and that's the reason why posture while lying flat on your back makes your apnea worse. But let me defer to H.V. Morton in terms of describing sleep apnea to you, and I'll read this to you. I detest snorers. I regard snoring as a contemptible and disgraceful thing. I think that a woman married to a snorer should be granted a divorce without any argument. It has always seemed to me a singular reflection on modern science that no silence has yet been invented for this complaint. During the war, when most of us slept in tents and tin huts, a boot, though primitive, was effective. But no boot could have interrupted the snore of Kilkenny. He actually shook the air. He filled the universe. I could feel his bass notes in the wall. How that man made me suffer. His ghastly organ recital was as regular in his devilish rhythm as a sawmill. Once every half hour, he was seized with a kind of convulsion. I hoped that he was dying. The debasing sounds shuddered to pianissimo and ceased. Then he gave a violent gasp, a snort, appearing to be choking, grunted, gasped, and gone to top gear again. Every man should be compelled to produce a certificate before marriage to prove that he is free from this horrible malady. I'm glad for the honor of Ireland to say that he was an English commercial traveler. So yes, but in defense of modern science, I want to say that silencers have been invented for sleep apnea. In the old days, we had to get this guy to jet in and generate a positive pressure to splint the airway open, but now we do that with something called continuous positive airway pressure, or CPAP. And since this is an innovation meeting, I should add that CPAP and related treatments for sleep apnea really have formed the basis for a multi-billion-dollar industry that's really expanding rapidly, particularly as the prevalence of sleep apnea increases. Now, as a cardiologist, I would feel guilty in talking about sleep apnea without at least alluding to the cardiovascular aspects. And bear with me now, briefly, while I talk about what happens to the heart and blood vessels in people with sleep apnea. So you're going to have to be patient with me here and believe what I tell you. Is that we take this microneurographic electrode compared here to a 22-gauge needle, and we insert it into a peripheral nerve. You can do it in the leg or the arm, but essentially what we're doing is we're tapping in to the vasoconstrictor signal going from the brain to the blood vessels, the message from the brain telling the blood vessels to tighten up. We measure that message, look at it on a real-time basis by sticking a needle into a peripheral nerve. And what I'm going to show you in the next slide is a recording of nerve activity from a person who holds his breath and stops breathing. And the reason I'm doing this is to give you an idea of what happens to apneic patients. Now, we had some trouble with the sound earlier, so I hope it goes smoothly. If it doesn't, it's my fault. And I will ask them to stop the slide as we go along, just so you catch up with it. So here we go. This is a slide. That's EKG. That's beat-by-beat blood pressure. Can you just hold it for a second to stop the slide? Great, thank you. So that's your EKG, beat-by-beat blood pressure. These are bursts of sympathetic activity. Each spike that you will actually hear is a packet of noradrenaline being deposited into the blood, near nerve blood vessel junction, causing the blood vessel to tighten up. So that raises blood pressure. And you'll actually hear the crisp sounds on the speaker. And this is breathing. This is a healthy young subject. All we're going to do is tell him to stop breathing for as long as he can. And I want you to listen to what happens to the nerve, see what happens to the nerve activity. Most important, see what happens to his blood pressure. From there to there is 50 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so you can start again, please. Apnea starts here, starts holding his breath. This is breathing, no breathing right there. And this is apnea. So what you've seen here is a rise in blood pressure about 80 millimeters of mercury because of the increased sympathetic drive during the apneic event. And it stops when it stops breathing. And when you have sleep apnea, this is what happens. Your blood pressure 130/60 when you're awake. When you go to sleep, it goes up to 240/130. That's a very high blood pressure. You treat them with CPAP, and you find blood pressure is much, much better. So sleep apnea is a fairly provocative thing from the cardiovascular perspective. It's a perfect storm of stress. And you'd think bad things would happen at night when you're sleeping. In fact, when we looked at people and when they had sudden death, we found that if you look at the general population, this is midnight to 6 a.m., 6 a.m. to noon, the general population, 16% will have sudden death at night, 35% in the morning after waking up. If you don't have sleep apnea, a chance of sudden death is just like what you see in the general population, 20% at night, 40% in the morning. But if you have sleep apnea, you are much more likely to die during the nighttime hours, midnight to 6 a.m., and less likely between 6 a.m. and noon. And the question is, how would you die? Well, your wife could beat and stab you. This is from Fargo, North Dakota. It's very much life-imitating art. And she was a former school principal. They'd been married for 18 years. She poured cold water on him, stabbed him with a pen, and hit him with a 3-pound fitness weight. Now, the lady has a point in more ways than one, because it's very tough to have an apneic right next door to you. And we've shown, Mayo researchers have shown, that the spouses of people with sleep apnea are clinically sleep deprived. And if it's any consolation, the apneics themselves are also very sleep deprived, because the only reason they start breathing again is they wake up from sleep and they start breathing. And that brings us to the next issue, that of sleep deprivation. Now, the body has evolved a mechanism to deal with the onset of darkness. As the sun sets, things become darker, and melatonin levels increase produced from the pineal gland. That melatonin makes you want to sleep, which is why a third of you here are drowsy and almost asleep. And that's not me, it's the darkness in the room making the melatonin come out. The problem is that the melatonin increases with darkness, and that makes you sleep, and when lights come on, melatonin goes down, and that helps you wake up. The trouble is, in the world we live in now, you find that, let's see, there we go. That's darkness, but it's not as dark as it used to be. Things are a lot brighter at night, and it's very interesting that certainly for North America, the lighting over the continent ties in very closely with the distribution of obesity that I showed you in one of the earlier slides. And it's getting worse lately because people are staying up in the dark but getting this artificial light that is shutting down their melatonin production, thereby preventing them from falling asleep or at least getting drowsy. Now, we are chronically sleep deprived. BFB means before Facebook. These are data from before Facebook. about a third of people were chronically sleep deprived for various reasons. And more recently, these are data from last year from the Sleep in America poll from the National Sleep Foundation. 2/3 of Generation Y's and 1/3 of Generation X's use a social networking site before bed, which means they got all this bright light into their faces, shutting down melatonin production. People who text before bed, which is about half of Generation Y, are more likely to sleep and drive while drowsy. And it's not just a North American phenomenon. 7 of 10 Brits are tweeting, poking, surfing, and writing on walls at night instead of going to sleep. So that, you know, sleep impairment, sleep deprivation is becoming increasingly widespread in large part because of electronic media. What does this have to do with weight gain? Now, if you look at epidemiologic data, what we find from multiple studies in N. Haynes is that this is sleep duration. You can barely see it from there, but this is 7 hours of sleep. This is less than 7, that's more than 7. You find that if you sleep less than 7 hours, it doesn't matter if it was 84, 87, or 92, you tended to have a higher BMI. If you slept more than 7 hours, your BMI tended to be less. So epidemiologic data suggests that if you sleep more, you're going to weigh less. That's just a phenomenon. Are there any mechanisms to explain that? Well, it may be due to hunger and appetite. These are data from Ev Van Korter and Corinne Spiegel at the University of Chicago, and they've done some extremely good work in this area. And what they showed was this is after 2 days of 4-hour bedtime in the orange, and this is after good sleep. Yellow is a good sleep. What they found was hunger and global appetite actually increased after 2 days of only 4 hours of sleep. So we actually tested this in a more comprehensive way. We admitted people to the clinical research unit for 14 days, of which 8 days were spent depriving one group of sleep and letting the others sleep as they wanted to. This is acclimation. I'll show you data for acclimation, the sleep deprivation, and recovery. And there's 2 groups of people. And basically, people who slept normally went to bed at 10 p.m., got up at 6. If you were sleep deprived, you went to bed at 12:40, got up at 6, 5.3 hours in bed. And this is Andy Calvin from my lab who helped lead the study. I don't want to belabor the technical details of this, but take my word for it. We were able to measure for pretty much all the time they were there for those 14 days, most of their brain waves tell you whether they were asleep or drowsy or awake. We measured virtually every calorie they consumed, and we were able to measure their energy activity expenditure. So we're able to tell you how much energy they expended. And essentially, these are the data. If you were sleep deprived in orange versus if you were not, if you were randomized to control group, you actually ate a lot more, 549 more calories. This is during the experimental phase, and this is during recovery, where you see that they started to maybe eat less because they were catching up. So the question is that you're asking, because you're smart people, is, well, sure, they ate more because they're awake longer. Well, we actually looked at that, and what we found was that the calorie intake per hour of wakefulness was also greater, both during experimental period and recovery. Now, recovery, they slept more, so that it's more calories per hour they consumed. So sleep deprivation actually increased the amount of calories they ate, but did not change the level of activity, which is a huge surprise for us. We thought if we sleep-deprived people, they're going to naturally exercise less, but they didn't. They actually exercised the same. Control group, sleep-deprived group, virtually the same levels of activity in both. This is acclimation, experimental, recovery, no real change. So sleep deprivation really didn't change how much exercise they did. It really changed how much calories they consumed. So in summary, what we found was modest sleep restriction increased caloric intake by 549 calories per day, and activity energy expenditure did not change. So what I've tried to do now in the last few minutes is talk to you about obesity, the problem, talk about sleep apnea and sleep deprivation, introduce you to the concept that both of these may be contributing to the epidemic of obesity through mechanisms that involve primarily increased energy consumption. And I'll finish by identifying these individuals. I think most of you know them. That's Edison, and this is Tim Berners-Lee. To avoid any controversy, I'm going to tell you he didn't invent the internet. He actually made it much more easier to use. And this is the guy who plays Mark Zuckerberg in real life. So I'm going to finish up very quickly. Can I take an extra 30 seconds? Is that okay? So, you know, we can talk about, you know, sleep deprivation making you fat, and getting fat is pretty tedious and annoying. But there are worse things about sleep deprivation than just putting on weight, and that is falling asleep unintentionally, particularly when driving. 2 groups of people, those who slept less than 7 and more than 7 hours, Those who sleep more than 7 hours are about 2 to 3 times more likely to fall asleep while driving. And I'll leave you with this last slide, which I hope doesn't offend anybody, but really I want to bring home the message to you that sleep deprivation, whether it's because of sleep apnea or because you choose not to sleep or you cannot sleep, is actually a potentially dangerous thing, not just for you, but for society at large. Thank you very much.